I saw your video interview with Jeff Sheldon. That was pretty great.
That was a fun one.
You did a thing this week as we recorded on your life mission, which obviously is something I am very excited about. You've been on the Homework podcast. I mean, you're all over the place.
It's kind of fun. And I'm trying to do a little more too. And actually before some of this, I did the automators thing too. So like there's a bunch of these that I'm kind of, pushing some stuff out. It's amazing what ADD meds will do. So, it's been fun. It's been a good one. Good couple 3 weeks, I guess.
So I'm familiar with the Automators podcast. That was great, even though I'm technically not an OmniFocus user anymore. I have not had a chance to listen to the Homework podcast. You want to give a little plug for that one?
Yeah, so that one, the Homework podcast is one that I can't say I listen to religiously, but that is one that I used to. It's one of the very first podcasts I ever subscribed to way back in the day. That was back when it was Dave Kalo and Aaron Mahnke and team.
Me too, yep.
So that was one of the early podcasts and such that I was a part of. That was when it was a part of, what was 5x5 before it was 5x5? What was it called?
Oh, geez, I don't remember.
But it was a part of that network that became Dan Benjamin's 5x5 network when he renamed it and such. I can't remember what it was called, though. So it was a part of that. So it was kind of a cool thing for me to be a part of that show. But we talked a lot about a number of things, like pen and paper systems, of course. Dave was fascinated that I'm still using an HPDA, Merlin Mann's index cards in the back pockets thing. So we got into that, but we talked a little bit about like notes structures. He asked about Obsidian to a degree, goals and how you choose to set things up. Goals in the sense of like, how do you decide what tools to use? So it was kind of a cool, wide-ranging conversation that went a whole bunch of different directions because, that's what I do. So the whole thing was, can they keep Joe on task? That was the goal.
Yeah.
And I don't know that they succeeded. It was fun, though.
I have not formally met Dave's co-host. Is it Harry Marks?
Harry Marks, yeah.
Yeah, but I think he does a great job on the podcast. And I've known Dave for a while. He's good people.
Yeah. He's actually going to be joining me on Analog Joe here before too long as well. So
awesome.
That'll be kind of fun.
Cool. Well, we've got a lot to talk about today, so maybe we should jump in here and hammer out this follow-up, which I only had 2 action items.
Yep.
And typical Mike fashion, I don't really have any way of reporting on these.
Nice.
They were,
job,
don't
sir.
share the outcomes and use and instead of but. I feel like that one I've made some progress with. I'm really hoping I don't embarrass myself and do that here on the podcast. Having said that, we will see how it goes.
Okay. Here's hoping.
Here's hoping. Let's talk about email.
Okay. I'm game.
So this book is A World Without Email by Cal Newport. And this is his newest book. It actually, as we record this, came out about a week ago.
Yep.
So we cranked through this one in order to record this today because, unfortunately, we did not get sent advance copies. Although, if you are a New York Times bestselling author and would like to send us non-fiction books ahead of publication,
Non-thrillers, non-sci-fi, like all these things.
We get those.
It's almost daily. You realize this. It's
Yes.
almost daily we get one of these.
Yep. Yeah. So, but this was a quick read. Cal Newport is a great writer. This will be an interesting conversation, I am sure, because the arc of Cal Newport's writing has kind of gone all over the place in terms of like being very much in line with Joe's way of thinking and very much in line with my way of thinking. This one may or may not converge. We will see. It was interesting. He mentioned, I think it was near the end, that he actually was working on this book as soon as he finished the manuscript for Deep Work. So it was kind of being developed alongside that one, which you can totally see, but then also Digital Minimalism came out in between there. And then if you go back even further, he kind of started off as like how to get good grades as a college student and so good they can't ignore you, which at some point we're going to have to cover that book because that book is really good.
You have to go back in time for that one. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, all that to say, this is the latest Cal Newport book. It looks awesome. Just talking about like the physical book, this thing on the spine, this is genius. I love this. I've had a couple people who have looked at this and said specifically like, wow, that looks really neat.
Yeah.
So very well designed, which is not kind of what I was expecting from a Cal Newport academic college professor type book. But yeah, let's jump into the contents here. There's a couple different sections. There's an introduction, which is pretty short, and then really 2 parts with a couple chapters each. So I have all the chapters listed in the outline here. We'll see if we hit all of these. I kind of think the conversation will happen based on the parts.
Right.
Part 1 is the case against email. Part 2 is principles for a world without email. And then our brief conclusion at the end, which is really his just commentary of a cool speech that somebody gave.
Yeah. Yeah.
But anything you want to add about the book in general before we jump into the specifics here?
Well, I will say that, like, the joke, right, was Joe has bad email practices. And the hope was that by us doing this, Mike is hoping to solve my email problems, I think. Because I don't have good practices with email according to the broader productivity world. I would tend to argue with a lot of people over that. So going into this, we've talked about before, like, what are your expectations when you go into this? And sometimes what you expect can kind of set the framework, I guess, that you view the book through, kind of set the lens, I guess, that you're looking at the book from. And I will point out that before I started reading this, I was coming at it very, very skeptical, which is backwards from the way I've normally come at Cal Newport's books, because you've heard all the hype about Deep Work, and then we read Deep Work, and it was like, oh, well, this is supposedly a really good book, so we were excited about it. Digital Minimalism, I had kind of the same viewpoint. So Good They Can't Ignore You, it's another that's we've heard a lot about. We haven't read that one, but I would expect good things about it. This one, A World Without Email, being somebody who works with people all over the place, email is very central to that. So I came at this like, okay, I'm looking out at this book from a side-eye view.
Yeah.
Instead of just diving in head first with it. So I just want to point that out, that I had that on the onset before we jumped into reading this. So that said, having gone through it, I'll share my views as we go, of course, but I just want to lay that foundation before we start driving through all of the content here.
Yeah, I completely understand that, because that is the exact same approach I had when we did the previous book, Thinking in Bets.
Oh, sure, yeah.
I went into it like, this is not going to be for me, and I was pleasantly surprised.
Right.
So we'll see if you get there by by the end. I also want to clarify here at the beginning, because I feel like the book title maybe makes this seem as like a tactical guide to spending less time in email. It's really not that. It's very Cal Newport-esque in, let's just blow up the system and figure out how to put it back together to accomplish the things that we want. And I understand that that is completely not doable for a large percentage of people who would read this, yourself included. So while I rib you a little bit and say, oh, you got bad email habits, I do also understand that you're not the one making the decisions about how these conversations necessarily are taking place.
Right.
And that is also not to say that if you are in a position like Joe, where you do have to deal with email, it's just part of the deal, then there is still, I think, things that you can take from this book. So it's not like a CEO level type read necessarily, but we'll get into the conversation here. Let's start with the introduction. He starts with a story about a person who started work with the government, and then right after being hired to be the director of innovation and entrepreneurship, the whole network broke based on a cyber attack, and they didn't bring it back up because they weren't sure exactly what was going on, so they just decided to burn it all to the ground and destroy everything in the office that had a chip in it, which is fascinating just in and of itself. I felt like,
Right.
that story could be unpacked and be 40 pages long, and that would be really entertaining. But
Yes.
typical Cal style, he tells a brief part of that story and then moves on. But the big takeaway from that story is that there was no email for 6 weeks in a position where they had relied on email. And I feel this does a great job of setting the tone and maybe disarming an argument from somebody like you who would say, I can't do this. Because they were in a position where if you would ask them, they would have said, I can't do this. And then they had to do this. And surprise, surprise, they found that they actually started doing better on their job because they had more white space and they were disconnected from the email. So what was your impression? How did you react to this story in this introduction?
It made a lot of sense, right? So if your email system is down, and I'll put another preface here, I've had this happen not to me on my entire email system, but I have had cases when I first took my IT director position at the church, their email structure that they were on had all sorts of crazy problems, and it would regularly go down. So I knew the moment the email was busted because they would call me. It's like, Joe, we have a problem. So like I've seen this happen. And although my email at the time through the church, like that particular email address that I had I barely got anything on it. So it was not a big deal to me. If you removed the 2 email addresses that I use regularly for all of my online stuff, that would be a different story. That would be very different. But a couple things about this was that, okay, so the email structure went down, right? And she was forced to do things outside of email, right? So she's making phone calls. She's, a lot of phone calls, doing a lot of in-person meetings and such. So she started doing a lot of those things in place of email. Totally on board with that. I totally get it. I don't know how many times I call people whenever emails are getting out of hand. So that is a thing I definitely would agree with. The trick is that she had an excuse for it. Like, this is something he doesn't really talk about, in that there was a reason, a very justified reason, that she was off of email for, it was a long time. And that period, whenever she talked to people, why didn't you get back to my email? They shut my email server down. Like, that's a pretty solid excuse. So you have a justified reason. You couldn't do that on your own. Like, you couldn't just run that experiment for yourself and say, I'm just not going to use email at all for 3 months. And then you're calling people and driving to people and doing all of that. And they talk, why did you get back to my email? I just don't want to use my email for 3 months.
Yep.
That's not going to fly. So there's 2 sides of that coin. One, if forced, yes, you can be better at things. And yes, you can get better at doing things without email. I think that's very solid. But if you don't have that forced upon you, you then have to use the rest of his book to understand how you can implement some of the benefits of what she was able to receive without the catastrophic server went down scenario.
Yes, I agree with you. This reminded me, this story, because it took place in the government, of the story of the Army using Scrum during the Battle of the Bulge in that book when we covered it, because they basically needed to find an alternative because what they were doing wasn't working. And then the minute that they got things under control, they went back to the old way of doing things.
Right.
Which is very typical, I think. They had to figure out a way to work without this. And then when it became available, I'm sure they don't still not do email. But it's also interesting because I feel a lot of what Cal does with his latest books is try to paint a picture of a different world. And he's not necessarily trying to say, like, these are the steps to get there, typical productivity systems style. But he's trying to inspire you, like, hey, think about this, because you probably never even considered what this would look like or that this was even a possibility. And so I feel like at this point, he's just trying to help you to to think that this is more than just a pie in the sky pipe dream. Maybe there's aspects of this that you could apply. He also introduces in this section the idea of the hyperactive hive mind, which comes up over and over and over again. So let's define this real quick. He says, the hyperactive hive mind is a workflow centered around ongoing conversations fueled by unstructured and unscheduled messages delivered through digital communication tools like email and instant messenger services. And I think everybody can kind of relate to that definition and has felt the pain of that in some way, shape, or form. The other thing he says here is that the future of work is increasingly cognitive. This is a theme from Deep Work. I 100% agree with that. We have to therefore understand how our brains work. And he's basically saying in this whole book that email is not in alignment with that. So I do believe he is 100% correct when he says that a world without email is not only possible, but inevitable. And people look at me like I've got a third eye in the middle of my forehead when I say that. But it just seems so obvious to me that this is not going to be the thing. Who knows how far down the road? It's probably not 5 years. It's probably not 10 years, maybe 20 years, 30 years, whatever. But email's not great. There's got to be a better way. And eventually we will collectively stumble on this and say, yes, this is better. The problem, I think, though, is that we take this path of least resistance, especially with our communication. He talks about this later on in the book, and we were talking about this before we hit record. People will send a one minute message with a question, and then it requires an hour-long response. Like the guy who emailed me, and he's like, hey, what do I have to do to get a response? I just asked a simple question about troubleshooting his monitor setup. Like, I don't know. It could be this, or this, you know?
Right,
and I finally did reply with 3 or 4 paragraphs, and the whole time I'm doing it, I'm like, this is exactly what Cal was talking about.
Yes. This is why, and I haven't been as good about this, but for a long time, my email I had a lot of emails like what you're talking about. If you write scripts and you do things to help people automate their systems, you get stuff like that. Like, this is what you're talking about too. Like, you get these things, right? I don't know how many emails I have in my inbox right now of, hey, Joe, can you get this script to do X, Y, and Z? And like, if it's somebody who texts me, like we know each other well enough that you have my phone number, generally I say yes to those because I know that it is something that person cannot do. And usually they're a little afraid to ask. By that point, they've taken like 3 weeks to conjure up the courage to say, hey, Joe, will you help me with this? Like, I know that. Yes, one of them's right here. So yes, I'm aware of that. Those I'll generally say yes to. The ones in my email, if it's people I don't know, no offense, but I get so many of them, it's impossible for me to do that for everyone. So what I've done historically is document the process, publish it on my blog, and when people ask, I send them a link. It's like, here, this is what you need. Go through this. Or I find somebody else who's done it and send links to that and then just done. And because I'm not going to take the time to write the 3, 4, 5 paragraphs it takes to try to debug your system over email, because that is just what we call a mess.
That's the exact reason I wrote that post about my DSLR camera setup.
Yes.
Because I get asked that question all the time.
Yep.
And now I have a place I can send people with links to all the gear that I use. And it is needlessly complicated. We were talking about this before we hit record. I actually have OBS running on my computer so that I can flip the display and send it to my iPad, which I have connected via Sidecar. And yes, I know Luna Display is supposed to work. It doesn't. And there are other things that should work and they don't. This is the solution for the M1 Mac because I set it up with my teleprompter and I want to be able to look right into the camera when we have conversations like this. I feel like the resulting communication ends up being a little bit better. So yeah, I totally understand where you're coming with that.
But now that you've said this out loud, people are going to want to know how you did it. And you're going to get an email about it potentially. So.
Link in the show notes.
Oh, that's just how this stuff goes.
Yeah. So let's jump into part 1, the case against email. And there are 3 chapters here. Do you want to tackle these individually? I mean, there's only 7 chapters in the entire book. Or should we just talk about the whole case against email.
Let's
generally
cover the whole case all in one shot,
Okay.
because basically email stinks. All right, part two.
Yes,
Let's
it
move
does.
on.
Well, there's 3 specific things, and that's why there's 3 chapters. And I think these are very well defined for someone who maybe knows they resent the fact that they have to spend a lot of time in email, but they haven't really articulated exactly why. This is gonna resonate. So chapter 1 is email reduces productivity. That's kind of the one, yawn, I expected this from Cal. Number 2, email makes us miserable. And that one kind of caught me off guard when I read that. I'm like, oh, well, yes, I agree, but that seems like a strong statement.
Right.
And then number 3, email has a mind of its own. So they feel very different. This does not feel like your typical listicle style article you would find on the web of 3 reasons why email is bad.
Yes.
And it feels more comprehensive to me. So I don't know, where do you want to start? Email reduces productivity is probably the logical place to start, but it's also the place we've probably talked the most about previously. So should we just cover this real quick?
There's a whole bunch here, right? So
Yep.
I feel like the bulk of what we need to cover is part 2. So part 1, the case against email, it can kind of be summarized in that our use of a tool that is supposed to make things better is making things significantly worse. It has a lot of unintended consequences, even though if you look, because there's all sorts of stories here, right? Some of which are about, some of the ones that were most interesting to me is like the origin stories to email, right? How it came about, how they used it when it first came about. One of the stories I think was most impactful from a lot of this was that the IBM story, where they hired a person to study how much communication was happening in the office. Because what they wanted to do is put in a mainframe to be able to handle email, right? That way they could figure out how much they needed to spend in order to have a system that would actually allow them to do the same amount of communication once they brought the system in. They're $1 million machines, like they're expensive. So to do that meant that they wanted to be exactly sure what they needed before they brought it so they didn't spend too much. They brought it in, they moved all of the stuff over, they had calculated how many memos are sent, how many voicemails are sent, how many people run up and down the stairs. Like they calculated all of this down so that they could figure out the exact number of messages that are being sent on a daily basis. Brought in a server that could handle that load, and it crashed in 3 days because of the overload?
Yes, because they had 5 to 6 times as many messages.
Right. And what they hadn't counted on, there was one major piece that attributed to it, the wonderful CC line, where you can just copy people on. I can send one message and send it to 15 people. They realized that very quickly and thought, well, I'll just do that. Well, on the server side, it's not one message, it's now 15. So it becomes a bit bigger than they intended. So then the whole thing comes down. Basically, the point is that email is supposed to help us communicate quickly, asynchronously, but because it's so easy to do, it comes with all of these other ramifications like we're talking about here. Reducing productivity because of the time and the fragmentedness of it. It's making us miserable because we're spending so much time on it, taking it home, not putting good boundaries around it. Has a mind of its own because the more you check things, the more you send responses, people realize you're available, thus they'll send more at those times, and it just creates this big vicious cycle.
Yeah. Well, I do think there's a couple things we should unpack here, starting on page 19, where he directly addresses your concern. He says, Joe Bueller, many people acknowledge that some jobs might benefit from significantly less interruption, but not theirs.
Yes. Yes.
And that is a quote pulled out of context, kind of, because I think you would agree with just that quote that your job would benefit from less interruption. But the larger point he's making is like, well, that would be great. And I'm sure some people can do this, but not me.
I would put a caveat on that in that parts of my job need it.
Sure.
and a fair amount of my job doesn't. And the people who work in the office with me know this, because there are times when I'm not anywhere near my email and you can't get a hold of me. So like that does happen. So yes, I think email is very vital to some aspects, but yes, I'll agree with him basically 100% on that. Yeah.
Yeah, because that section, the header for that section is email is not a job. And that sounds a little bit controversial. Well, what about customer support? What about sales? Like those are the two that people always push back on me with when I say email is not a job. And I think what he is saying is that the job is that you have to respond to people quickly. And the default for many, many, many years has been email is the way to do this. But I think it's important to disconnect those two, even if you are not in a position of power to shift the way that the communication happens. Recognize that email in and of itself is not necessarily the job. Maybe communication is the job. And at that point, we can start to look for maybe better ways to do that. One of the stories that he told in that section was George Marshall, the U.S. 5-star general, which I thought was pretty great. He frames this story as this is the guy who was really responsible for winning World War II, was it? Dwight Eisenhower, the Eisenhower Matrix. He's the one who gets a lot of credit for like the important versus urgent stuff. But this is the guy who really implemented it. Because he had a structure for every single interaction that he had. In fact, he's a 5-star general, right? So he
was the very first 5-star general, I think. Right?
Could be. That I don't know. But basically, he's the one who said, don't salute me when you come into my office in order to save time. And then right away, you're supposed to begin your brief, and he will ask for a recommendation, and then he will delegate the action. That is the formula. And I thought that was really interesting that we talked earlier about there's government and policies, and we talked about Scrum. We talked about the 6-week email shutdown. This is an example of somebody who is working a government, but it's counterintuitive to that. It's not falling into that trap or that formula that we typically think of. He's saying, no, this is the way that we're going to do this. And it feels very contradictory to the standard protocol that people are supposed to follow. So I found that really interesting. The other thing I found really interesting in here, which we could have probably a whole big conversation about this, is he makes a statement that GTD rose in popularity as email began to take off. I kind of think he's right on with this, and I feel like he articulated something I have felt about GTD that has bothered me for years, because I have not really implemented GTD for a long time, even though when I read that book the first time, I was like, aha, this is great. I found the answer. I had the same response that probably everybody else does. And as I think about like, why did that resonate with me back then? It's because I was overwhelmed. I had too many inputs, and I was trying to become just a little bit more efficient to squeeze out some time for the things that were important to me. And my working situation has changed to the point now where I can be more intentional and be more focused. And so now I think about GTD and that standard process. And if it takes less than 2 minutes, just do it. And I'm like, no, I don't want to do anything that takes me less than 2 minutes to do, because it's probably not worthwhile doing. Like I would prefer I'm going to write this big article, and I'm going to focus on that one article all day. And I'm going to write that article. And there'd be different aspects of that, mind mapping the article, maybe doing some keyword research, actually writing the article, getting the screenshots or images that are required for it, maybe even recording a video. But I would lump that all under like that big task. And you could make the argument, well, that should be a project. You should break it down piece by piece. But when you have the time and the space to work on something in a deep way like that, the question you're left with is why? Because David Allen told me to,
right?
Because I'm constantly running back and forth between different things, because I'm constantly getting interrupted by email, maybe.
I think one of the things that's interesting, because I don't know that this is wrong, what he's saying, like GTD and email rising at the same time, because they did come to full popularity at about the same time. And I wonder, because I've kept up with David Allen and his whole getting things done culture and the stuff he's continued to put out, because I think a lot of what he says is solid. And there's a thing that I've noticed. There's like an undertone that he has been alluding to, at least within the last couple years that I've noticed, and that is that if your system can't handle what you're throwing at it, you need to back off what you're putting into it.
Correct.
And I kind of wish that was more of a core tenet to what he pushes, because a lot of what Cal Newport is saying here has to do with eliminating inputs, right?
That feels like a concession to me, honestly, that statement, because email has grown and grown and grown. Email has a mind of its own, right? It's going to evolve. And if you look at any of the videos, talks that he gives, whatever.
David Allen or Cal?
Sorry, David Allen.
Okay.
If you look at the people who are in the audience, it's business guy, suit and tie, busy executive. And those are the people who would also argue, well, I can't break away from my email. There is no way that I can do that. So Cal's basically saying maybe there's a connection here. And I think there kind of is. He says a little bit more strongly. He says email is responsible for our frenetic pace of activity. And he also says, and this I agree with, GTD gave people a way to deal with an increase in volume. But at some point, efficiency is not the answer.
Right. And I think that's some of what I'm getting at here, right? So I'm not saying GTD is the answer to everything here. I'm just saying that GTD can help with, because I still use that system to a degree. Whenever I stop and look at what I'm doing, it basically is that. The difference is that the broader GTD community generally thinks of GTD as a way to handle the huge influx of things that are inevitable, quote unquote, to come into my inboxes, right? So Facebook and social media can be a bank of inboxes. Email, of course, is a big inbox. There are a lot of these things, to use some of David Allen's terminology, inboxes, right? But I think what Cal is telling us is that you wouldn't need something like GTD if you didn't allow all these huge influxes of inputs to hit you in the face. Like, it wouldn't be that necessary. So although I think GTD could be a good thing, I think the reason it took off is a bad thing.
Exactly. The problem that it's solving, intentionally or unintentionally, I don't think is as altruistic as it first appears when you come to it.
Right.
Because it's kind of a symptom, not disease solution. That's kind of the revelation I got from thinking about GTD prior to this. I've kind of been brewing on this for a while, but I didn't have a good way to articulate the tension and the friction that I felt about it until I read this book. And then when he made the connection between email being a driver of the frenetic pace of activity and GTD being a way to deal with the frenetic pace of activity, I was like, aha, that makes total sense.
Right.
And it's not just email, it's Slack, it's a bunch of other things, but that hyperactive hive mind, that's the thing that he keeps coming back to. Hyperactive hive mind doesn't resonate as much as a world without email. That's why he didn't use it as a title. But ultimately, that is what he is addressing here. The tools you use for this may change. And in fact, in chapter 3, he kind of talks about the 3 drivers of the hive mind at the office: the hidden cost of asynchrony, the cycle of responsiveness, and the caveman at the computer screen. The hidden cost of asynchrony, this kind of, this has a couple different aspects. It's easier to just throw out an email than it is to pick up the phone and call someone or set up a meeting and actually talk to them. That's good in some senses, bad in other senses. We already talked about how you can ask a question and it doesn't take you very long, but then the person responding has to spend an hour crafting a response.
Right.
And I feel like the asynchrony piece, what it allows you to do is completely disconnect from the true cost of the interaction, because you're not there watching the other person and waiting for them to respond, even though you probably are just hitting refresh on your computer every couple minutes, or every time you get a ding, going and looking and seeing if the answer that you need is there. But we need to recognize the true cost of the interaction. And if that's all we did, regardless of whether we used email or not, communication would be a lot more effective. But asynchrony and email specifically makes it easy to gloss over and not recognize those true costs.
This plays into, we've talked about digital minimalism, and some of the books we've talked about the science behind social media and the notification system, the like system that comes with that, right? So what they do in a lot of those cases is split up the time so that you don't know when a notification is coming. Like if you don't know when something's coming, you'll have a tendency to spend more time on it and check that thing, that app, that system more often. Email is exactly that. Like this is by accident built to be addictive. That is the addiction cycle, right? So, or one of, there's a bunch of those actually. So it's one of those. So you have to be very careful, and it's easy to fall into some of that trap, I think, just because of the nature of the beast here that we're talking about. So I don't think anyone's going to argue with us that email has some downsides. A lot of the science and stuff that he shares here is like, you had me at the beginning of the first chapter. Like we got 3 chapters of this. Like, I'm with you. Like I get it. It kills productivity because you're checking it all the time. I really don't like dealing with it. Like they're saying in the chat, if you get a really small question in your email, it's easy to have to deal with the big long response. Because if I don't take the time to craft something like my question well, that person responding to it has to put a whole lot of work into doing this. Even like the support structures for apps and systems and services, right? Like how many of these, you see like the little chat box in the bottom right. You see that? Where you go to the system and it's got the little thing in the bottom right. And if you have a support question, you can just tick that, ask a question, and somebody gets back to you within a few minutes. And it's like, okay, think about the mass number of people and the structure that's got to be in place so that someone can get that from anyone, any time of day, and get a response back in a few minutes. So what I try to do, and I know not everyone does this, probably most people don't. I know, having been in IT support for a while now, that the better I ask my question and the more I frame what has happened that I have an issue with, the quicker they can get back to me.
Yes.
So my answer that I need can be received much, much faster if I take the time up front to ask the questions correctly. But before we jumped, I just opened my email because I wanted to know what was in my inbox right now so that we could talk about this. And I have a handful of things in there that I know right now are one-line questions. Like what you were talking about earlier is like, what's wrong with my monitor? Like, there's so many things. Like if you had taken the time to write me 2 paragraphs of explaining what you've done and what's gone on behind it, what's wrong with the script, how have you tried to install it?
Then you could respond with a single sentence.
Correct. I could probably get back to you within a handful of hours based on my email practices, and you would probably have an answer. But if it's going to require me to do some testing and some exploring to figure out what's going on with it, there's not a good chance I'm going to do anything with it.
Exactly. And nobody does that.
Correct.
I could say on this podcast, because it's you and I, that everybody does that, because I do the same thing. When I have a technical issue, this is the OS that I'm running. This is the app version that I'm using. Here's a video that shows exactly what I'm talking about. And 99% of the time, the response is like, wow, this is really helpful. Thank you. We have our team on this. We'll get back to you shortly. But nobody does that. It's, hey, why isn't this working? I don't know. Like at that point, well, you can't fault people for that sort of request either, though, because they're completely overwhelmed and they have this question. And if they took the time to craft 3 paragraphs, there would be 12 more dings that they would have to respond to. And so they can't keep up. Recognize that. That's why they're shooting off this quick question. But then they've just thrown the whole burden on your lap. And even if you don't have an entire hour to craft the response right now, Actually, sometimes it's even worse. If you do have an hour to craft the response, you could send that back, given the information that they shared you. Oh, actually, there's this other thing here. Oh, well, that changes everything. And now you got to do it again. So what ends up happening is you do that a couple times and you're like, okay, well, I'm not going to spend that effort on the front at the front end anymore. I'll just dash out a quick response. Okay. Now you're playing email ping pong and you've got 12 more back and forths before you finally land on the specific issue. I absolutely hate this. And so the best solution I've found is just not respond to email, which I get, like, people can't do that. And I know it makes people angry. That's just, it's so frustrating to me. If you were to put a camera and watch my facial expressions as I deal with email, I probably start off like, oh, hey, happy Mike. And then by the end, I'm like,
I would love to see that, actually.
I guarantee that's what happens, because it grates it's like fingernails on the chalkboard of my soul. I cannot stand it. So I do whatever I can to spend as little time in there as possible.
Sure. I get it. I do. But you're absolutely right. Somebody's going to have to spend time on it. And if you're the one asking the question, it should be you. Don't put it on the other person. Like, that's my view on it. It can get things done much, much quicker. But at the same time, phone calls and in-persons, or in today's world, video calls, are significantly better for that sort of thing. It may take, a bit of a mess to set up technologically sometimes, but the broad scheme of things is it's done much, much faster and more thoroughly, right?
In general, yes. Although I have talked to people who, with COVID and working from home, what they found is that their higher-ups are scheduling these meetings all day, every day, because they want to know what their people are doing, what decisions they're making, what direction, all the in-person stuff that used to happen at the office. They're trying to use video calls to replace that. The people who actually have to do the work, however, they're spending, not an exaggeration, 40 out of 40 hours per week in meetings, and then they're expected to go do all their regular work. So there's a disconnect there where the higher-ups who are talking about the work, they don't make the connection between, oh, my people actually need the time to do the work, and they're at home, and their kids are at home, and they're doing school at home. And so the people who are actually trying to do the work, they're just completely stressed out because they have no time for anything.
I have a story about this that will solidify what you're saying. So the job I took after I worked corporate was a virtual marketing company. And one of the big projects that I was the head of was to rebuild our internal system. I can't go into the details of what it is. It was very proprietary and such. So we had to rebuild our internal system. I had one other database person on staff with me, and between the two of us, we were going to rebuild it. Now, the idea was keep the team small so that we could move fast, so that we could get this done very quickly. It's not a huge application. It wasn't going to take a whole lot of time. However, the problem we ran into was that the board of directors and our higher-ups wanted to have a lot of input into how it was built, like what the UI and stuff looked like. And that's fine, but it's a virtual company. So I was in meetings usually every day talking with different directors at each time, trying to get input from them, which is fine. And then at the end of the week, we would do a check-in to see how much work had been done on it. And it was rare that we made progress on it, because between this database person and myself, he was trying to figure out the data models based on how we could share data with people, with our clients. Thus, the directors were meeting with him all the time. They were meeting with me all the time on the front end side of it, and we weren't getting anywhere. So they decided, because we were so, and I told them, I was like, we're in meetings all the time. I don't actually have time to write code. They decided to book a week, like the conference rooms at hotels. They decided to book one of those so that this database person and I could go to this room. We'd have a week off from absolutely all meetings. We weren't allowed to book any time with anyone so that we could work on this and make some solid progress on this tool. Day one, we worked for 2 hours in the morning, and then my phone rang. And it was my direct boss wanting to know if I would go look at a handful of emails that had been sent from a couple of the directors because they had some input on the specific pieces we were building. So they wanted me to respond to those. 2.5 hours later, after I'd gotten through all of those, I took a break from that. It was lunchtime, so we went and grabbed lunch, came back, had to run through. I didn't get anything done that week. Those first 2 hours are what we got done. And the rest of the week was still managing. We weren't in meetings. We were managing phone calls and emails all week. So when we got done, like, here's the problem. It was about a month later I left the company. So just a complete mess. It's exactly what we're talking about here, right? So this ends up creating a whole mess unless you're able to separate from all of these communication systems. I'm sure tons of people are dealing with this today because of all the virtual work that's out there. But this is where maybe we should transition into part 2 here, because part 2 kind of explains what to do instead of that. And I think some of the principles there would be extremely helpful to explain the alternative to this.
Yes, agreed. So chapter 4 is the attention capital principle. That's probably the place to start. And I do, real quickly before we go in here, I do feel that the whole point for the first section is to just articulate this pain point as much as humanly possible to motivate you to change. My dad has a saying, when pain is sufficient, change will come. 100% true. And so Cal is kind of hoping that he's made you hurt enough to try to make some changes. In this next part. So the attention capital principle, this is the productivity of the knowledge sector can be significantly increased if we identify workflows that better optimize the human brain's ability to sustainably add value to information. The big story that he told from this section is the Model T and Henry Ford. And this was an interesting story because you've probably heard aspects of this before, but he adds a little bit more detail in terms of the level of cost that was required to make that assembly line really work. And he addresses some complaints against it too, where he's talking to somebody and he says, well, that sounds miserable. I wouldn't want to be a worker in that particular scenario, because you kind of get this picture of like, well, the assembly line, things are always moving and they're just moving too fast and you have to like kill yourself in order to keep up. But that's not actually what happened here. What happened was, instead of taking all of the parts and manually, going and getting what you needed and putting it together, that was like step one. You have somebody who understands everything about the car and they're going and getting what they need and then putting it on the car. Step 2 is we've got separate people who are doing separate systems. And so when this car is ready for this particular system, that person comes over with their stuff and they do the thing. But step 3 is the car just moves. And when it's in front of you, you do your thing and then it moves on to the next thing. And they went from taking 12.5 hours to build a Model T to getting it down to 93 minutes, which is really impressive. You hear those stats and like, oh, obviously I understand now why they incorporated that assembly line, but they didn't know they were going to be able to get to that. And they had to build some really expensive systems along the way in order for that to work. And as he was telling that story, I kind of half expected him to share a detail of Henry Ford at one point being like, you know what? I don't know if this is really going to work. I think maybe we've sunk enough money into this project and we should just go back to the way things were.
Right.
I've been involved in enough companies and organizations that have thought that way. Where it's like, well, I'm not sure we're actually riding the right horse here. So let's go back and do what we know works.
One of the things, and we haven't talked about this yet, but one of the things I love about this second part specifically is that all of the examples he uses to show, I shouldn't say all, a lot of the foundational stories that he uses to set these up, to set up these principles and explain how things work, come from the 1800s and the early 1900s. Did you catch that?
Yeah, very historical.
Almost every single story has a deep history to it.
Lots of Peter Drucker.
Yep. Lots of Neil Postman, Marshall McLuhan. Like, there's a lot of that sort of thing here. And he does use like some modern, 2019 stories in this, but he sets it all up with these 1890s, 1910s, like that's sort of time period, which I think is fascinating because it's kind of like saying, this is not new. This is just another repeat of history, thus the importance of maintaining and teaching history as it truly happened. So that is a thing that continues to be repeated through this book. I love that. I love it. It's cool.
He mentions Sam Carpenter in this chapter too, which I really liked seeing that because that Work the System book was very impactful for me when I read it. Are you familiar with Sam Carpenter and Work the System?
Yeah, I've not read Work the System, but I know of it and the concept behind it.
So the TLDR with Sam Carpenter is that he was managing a call center and was at a point, he gets into more detail in his specific book, but he was at a point where he could not afford to make payroll, and it was coming up in a couple of days. So he had this idea to systematize everything in the company, create standard operating procedures for everything. And he was finally at that point where he was desperate enough to try something new. And in Work the System, he talks about how once he started doing that, immediately everything got a lot better. They became much more profitable. They became much more productive, but even more so, and this is the thing that gets lost, I think, when you start talking about the assembly line and Work the System with Sam Carpenter, it's easy to be critical because on the surface, it looks like it's purely a focus on efficiency. But having read Work the System several times, I also know that the people who work there love working there, and the quality of life for them is much less crazy than it is for people who work at other call centers. And I know people who have worked at other call centers in other parts of the world, and it's just like you get 5 minutes every couple of hours and it's timed for your bathroom breaks. Like, it's miserable. Nobody wants to do that. So yes, it's a hard industry, and that maybe taints your perspective going into that sort of story, but that's not the only thing that we're focusing on with this sort of stuff is efficiency. So I do want to make sure that people understand that as we're talking about this and as Cal's talking about this, because I feel like it's very easy to overlook that.
Yeah, it's a good point. It really is. But again, the principle here is that, so the attention capital principle, you can only put your attention in so many different places. And namely, you can only put it in one place at a time. And when you're switching that, we've talked about this before. To me, this is one of the more obvious principles in this. It's like, just be aware that you can't be doing email and other things at the same time. And if you've got somebody who's in programming and such, they're very likely going to be disrupted even more if you have a single 20-minute meeting somewhere midday. Like, breaking up that attention and that focus has pretty major detriments to it, which he discusses, of course, in part 1.
Yes, exactly. Also in this section, we discover that Cal Newport works off of a Trello board.
I did not know that.
We will talk more about in the next chapter here, the process principle. He tells the story at the beginning of this chapter about Pullman brass. Pullman is interesting to me because it has ties to my specific area. I believe Appleton, Wisconsin was one of the first places that they had the electric streetcars. We have a restaurant down near the river that's named after Pullman's. The National Railroad Museum is in Green Bay, about 30 miles away. And they've got several of the original like Pullman coaches and all the stories behind the company and stuff. But the story that he's telling about the brass, this was a division of Pullman where they made all of the brass pieces that they need to put together the cars. And the process for requesting pieces from the brass works was very inefficient. People could just walk up and talk to anybody on the line, and that's often what they did, because that was the only way to get something when you really needed it, which that sounds a lot like an open office environment.
It sounds great. Very efficient.
The point is that compounds the problem, right? You've got this process, you can't keep up, and so people circumvent the process in order to get what they need faster. Everybody has been in a situation where they've experienced that.
Yes.
So their response to meeting the demand was actually to make more complicated processes and narrow the vectors that people could request things. So you had to go through a single entry point, and you had to fill out these specific forms, and it took more work to request something. But because now they had a single point where the requests are coming in and they had a channel that they flowed through, they were able to be much more efficient. They were able to meet their demand, and they ended up turning a large profit instead of being a large drain on the company itself. So that's kind of sets the stage for this whole chapter of, the work isn't changing, the inputs aren't even necessarily changing, but the process needs to change, which is a very interesting way to think about this. He gets into this section here on like personal Kanban and using boards and things like this. I think this is brilliant. I never thought of this as a replacement for email. I know a lot of places where it cannot be, but I think it might be for me.
Sure. I thought it was interesting that, he gets into Trello and has a couple examples of how, namely one major example of a company that uses Trello instead of email to manage all of their projects and processes and such. I thought it was interesting that Basecamp didn't come up. If he's going to talk about tools, Basecamp's the one that's been around for a long time and is like specifically geared to help people get off of email through the communication systems that they have built into it, and has like an all-encompassing process, which is very similar to what he's talking about in Trello. So I don't know. I thought that was interesting, but it might just be that because obviously Cal Newport has a computer background to him, right? And folks in that realm know Scrum, Agile, and Kanban is part of that. So I'm sure that has a pretty big, what do I say, a bias put into it because of that. So maybe.
Yeah. Well, Basecamp doesn't do Kanban, which seems weird to me. That's one of the big reasons we switched away from it at the Suite Setup, because we wanted a Kanban workflow. So we hacked that together in Notion, and it does make things a lot easier when dealing with like outside contributors and managing an editorial calendar. I feel like Basecamp should definitely add Kanban because they have a lot of other features that are designed to break the reliance on the constant communication and help you break away from talking about the work and actually do the work, which is really, what you were driving at there. So that feels like very low-hanging fruit, but I also think with Basecamp specifically, it's just like any other project management tool. You could use it in a very poor way and be completely stressed out. In fact, I've done that before, using Basecamp specifically.
Right.
It was several years ago, V1 of Basecamp, but I've felt that. We were working on a development project with the family software business, and the development team was on the other side of the world, so they were working while we were sleeping. We get up in the morning and all the stuff is there. And then you spend like all day responding to things. And then they take your input and they go and they work on something and ship it. But that kind of worked out because we were in different time zones and we weren't able to communicate in real time. But
sure.
The whole time we were doing that, I look back on it now and I kind of feel like, well, if we had been in the same time zone and worked directly, that would have been a disaster.
Yes.
So Basecamp really, that's not what it was designed for. You could have used any internet-based tool and plugged it in there and it would have accomplished the same goal. And had we been in the same time zone and worked at the same hours, Basecamp would have been a complete mess.
Sure.
I do think there's something to this using boards approach. And I don't know exactly what it is. And Cal didn't do a good enough job explaining it that I can articulate it well. But I have always felt a little bit bad about my use of task management systems. I remember being on Learn OmniFocus with Tim Stringer and doing my demo, and people at the end were making comments like, wow, you really don't have much in there. I was like, what? I guess I should have more projects. I guess I should have more tasks. And I felt bad that I didn't have thousands of tasks in there. And Cal Newport is basically like, no, you know what? That's okay. Because really what you need is a simple way, and boards are the way to do it, to manage the things that you're going to do, the things that you're working on, and the things that are done. I am 100% in on trying to work completely with boards. I've been kicking around different task management things recently when I've been playing with Obsidian. And I mentioned to you that there's this really cool Todoist plugin, which will take your Todoist tasks and you can embed them inside of a page. And I think I like that because I can embed tasks for a specific project inside of Obsidian. I can get to them that way if I really need to see everything that's associated with a particular project. But Todoist also supports boards. And the one project I have in there at the moment is the project for writing the next version of my book. And it is set up as a board inside of Todoist. And I love that approach. It's working really, really well. And so I think I'm going to try to do that same sort of thing with all of my tasks and not feel bad about not having a bunch of different boards. He does talk about the best practices for individual task boards and having more than one board that you're using. So I don't know exactly what this is going to look like, but this is an action item for me, is to use Kanban boards for my personal task management. And that makes things simpler because I've already got the stuff I'm doing for TSS that's inside of Notion. So I'm not going to try to track that inside of a personal task management too. That's just a different board in a different place. And when I'm in work mode, I can look at that board. And when I'm working on the book, I can look at that board. I think this is going to be the thing that really works for me. And I'm going to use it. I'm still going to use my fancy notebook, still write out like, these are the tasks I'm going to do today. But in terms of like managing the projects, I don't need more information than this is the stuff that's yet to be done. This is the stuff that's in progress. And this is the stuff that I've actually shipped.
I think, you mentioned the fewer things that you have in your system. And I think over time, I've had the move to fewer and fewer things in task management. I think the bullet journal kind of forces that to a degree, just because you're not going to write things at that level. This is one of the things I think GTD has done us a disservice in, because one of the things that David Allen pushes is you define your project, right? And then you define the individual steps, like the definitions he has for a project versus a task. Like if a project has more than two steps, more than one step, it's a project, right? So that could mean buy light bulb, install light bulb. That would be two tasks in the system. My system has buy light bulbs, and that's it. Like, that's all it is.
Yes, exactly. That's been a huge point of friction for me too, and I never understood why.
Yeah, and this is what I've moved more and more towards, is to use David Allen's definition. A lot of times I have a list of projects for the day, to use his definitions again, right? But if I were to break that down in the way that he intends or recommends, that list would be at least 10 times as long as what it actually is. And I don't find the value in breaking it down that far. Like the return on that isn't there, I don't think. To a degree, for some people, I can see how it is. But to me, it's just extra work. And if I can just bust out writing 7 or 8 things down on my list of the things I have to get done today, like I know that breaks the whole 3 MIT thing, but if I've got 7, 8, I've had days where I've got 18 things on that list. I got them all done, but technically those are all projects. And the overhead involved with managing it the way that GTD recommends, it does 2 things. It makes that system very big and unwieldy, and you have to use something like Todoist or OmniFocus just to keep track of it all.
Yeah.
And the overhead involved with putting it into that system and then managing it is quite high. Thus, you have so many people. I remember you're talking about Learn OmniFocus. Whenever I've done, I don't know how many sessions I've done there now, but one of them that I did there was a gentleman that had questions. And he's like, how do you decide what to do next? And he said that he had his dashboard setup. If you followed me, like the historical dashboard that I've set up, where just automatically would put a list together for the day, which is cool concept, mess in philosophy. And it was something he had done, but he was getting 200 to 300 things on that dashboard list in a day. He's like, I just don't know how to choose what to work on.
Exactly.
And it's like, dude, like you've gone to two things, like you've broken it down way too far, and then you've made too many things the most important thing for that day. So between those two, you got a mess on your hands. You're going to have to either scale it back as far as what you're putting into it, so you're only looking at 10 things instead of 300, but also say no to things. Like that's part of the trick. And I think that's some of what we're getting at with the dangers of that. Now, I'm hesitant because I know GTD has some benefits, but it does have some of these potential downfalls.
Yes. So with GTD, something like a meeting, which I would not put as a MIT, but let's just, for the sake of argument, say that there is a meeting. There's actually at least 3 tasks with each one of those meetings that you have. There's prep for the meeting, which is going to take longer than 2 minutes. There's be a participant in the meeting, which who knows how long that's going to take. And then the processing of the meeting notes and creating the tasks associated with it. Even if you aren't doing any of those tasks in the moment, each one of those things is going to take longer than 2 minutes and must be identified as something you need to do for a single meeting, which maybe is only 30 minutes long. Okay, now imagine you're in back-to-back meetings all day in hour intervals, so you've got 8 of these. That's insane.
Yes, it's a lot.
Now, regarding the MITs, I've been jotting down 5 of them in my notebook, but I am not including meetings in those for the most part. When we record a podcast, I will include that, but that is one of the things I think is genius about these analog cards. There's 10 spaces on here, but if you look at the website, Jeff actually shows like meetings on that list. So I think the number, you mentioned 7 to 8. I don't think you're too far off there. I just think we need to rethink how the things that we are actually doing and recognize that a meeting is actually a task. It is going to use up some time, and you're going to have less other time to do other things. So don't feel bad about the number, but recognizing this is the number I can get done in a day is very important. Because as long as you don't have that, you will continue to throw these things on your list, like processing these meeting notes, because GTD, I can't do this in 2 minutes. And at the end of the day, you've got another 8 hours of work. Just follow up from the meetings before you do your actual work. And then you get to, by the way, go to bed exhausted, wake up tired, and do it all tomorrow.
We need to keep moving. But yes, you're absolutely right. So the moral of the story is we don't manage this stuff well. We're dumb when it comes to all this stuff, so we need to get better at it. Thus, he brings us to chapter 6, which is
the protocol principle,
which I think is interesting.
This is all about doing things the right way. So protocol principle is actually designing rules that optimize when and how coordination occurs in the workplace. Is a pain in the short term, but it can result in significantly more productive operation in the long term. This is, if I were to summarize this, defining the rules of engagement for how communication happens at work. And he has a couple different tactics for how to do that. The big one that he advocates for, and he even kind of pokes holes in his theory that this is a good solution. He mentions he presented this a while ago, and since then he's realized it's really not that great as a comprehensive solution, but it can still be useful, is this whole concept of office hours. They can't replace email for timely interactions, but I have seen this in effect where you define this is the time to get questions answered. And if you have a question before then, you wait until that time. And magically, people who wait get their answers answered and they're okay with it, even though initially they're like, well, I probably will have something super urgent that I'll need an answer for. In reality, even if these office hours are only once a week, like a weekly team meeting, once you get used to doing things this way, it's a lot less hectic and everybody is usually okay with it.
Yeah, I think chapter 5 and chapter 6, so the process principle and then the protocol principle. When I read those in my head, I was like, well, how is he going to break those apart? Those seem very, very similar to me. So just to clarify some of that, the process principle is kind of the way that things move through your system.
Yep.
Right. So this is the process, the steps that something works through. Once it hits me, this is the step that goes next. And then it goes to the next one. And then it goes on to the next one. Like, that's the process. Think of it as a workflow. And that's where the Kanban thing can come in, right? The protocol principle is kind of like the rules of engagement.
Yep.
And probably the clearest way to think of that is like it's the rules and the requirements to get it into that process that we just created the chapter prior. Like, that's, I mean, there's some pieces that talk about as it moves and such, but generally it's how things come into it. Think of the brass process that you were talking about earlier. They ended up creating a form that then had to go to somebody and then they approved, and like it created this whole friction point. This is similar to what I do at our church, actually. We have a whole like room request process. If you want to request a room for a class or a meeting in some form, you have to fill out this form and hand deliver it to our receptionist. And people have repeatedly asked, do you have just a place online I could do this? Is there a way we could just can you just email me the form? Like, people ask this all the time. And I'm the IT guy, right? So I would be the one that sets that up. And I repeatedly tell them, the moment you do that, you will get at least double the number of requests. We're already in a weird spot.
Probably 5 to 6 times based on the IBM example.
Yes.
Right?
So I'm the naysayer on this one. It's like, I'm not doing that because you're going to get a whole bunch more and it's going to be unsolicited and you won't get to ask questions and it's going to make a mess. So we've never done it. I've had this on a repeated conversation for about 3 years, but we have a very strict protocol, right? You have to show up. You have to collect the form, you have to fill it out and hand it back to us. And then it has a whole process it goes through to get it to the right people, depending on what you've put on that piece of paper. But it creates the friction point, right?
Yeah. Well, friction isn't necessary. Like, there's the real principle at work here is that there are costs to everything. So friction and cost, that's a form of a cost, but it's not the only one that we need to consider. That's what he's talking about in this chapter, is that there could be non-monetary costs like cognitive cycles. Another cost is inconvenience, but that's outweighed by the improving the signal to noise ratio. The requests that come in are truly legitimate requests. And this gets back to a concept called information theory, which he summarizes at the beginning. This part was hard for me to get through and really understand. This is Cal speaking as a college professor and me having to struggle a little bit to process this. But I think it's important. So the information theory basic idea here, if I were to try to summarize this, is that the protocols that take into account the structure of the information being communicated can perform much better than a simply naive approach. And the naive approach is, well, let's just make this more efficient, throw it on the web, anybody can fill this out because that's easier for me. But they don't consider the whole chain that things have to go through. And he addresses a couple specific things in terms of protocol here with like meeting scheduling. He says standard meeting scheduling protocol equals energy minimizing email ping pong. I completely agree with that. I have been, I still am guilty of this occasionally, but I shy away from this for whenever I can. He advocates that you consider using a scheduler. That is the simple solution. It's a little bit tricky because you have to shift people's expectations, but that's the common thread between anything that he says in this entire book. The criticism of the schedulers is that they're cold and impersonal, and I'm a friend who wants to meet you for coffee. Why are you sending me through this cold, emotionless system? You know, but from a work perspective, I think it's maybe a little bit easier to get everybody on board with like, okay, so these are the real costs when someone wants to schedule a meeting. And here's a different way of doing it, which there are trade-offs, but ultimately the cost of this is going to be less. So how about we try this? That's ultimately the conversation that needs to happen. And that's not a new idea in this book, by the way. He talks about this in Deep Work too. One of the things that resonated for me from that book was a story of the woman who was always having to respond to something that her boss wanted. And she kept track of all the different times that she was interrupted. And then she scheduled a meeting and she said, well, what do you pay me to do here? What is it? What would you say it is exactly that I do here? And they defined together, like, this is the thing that's most valuable. And then she says, well, okay, I don't have any time to do that because I'm doing all this stuff for you. And then he's like, oh, okay, I guess I got to quit interrupting you. And how about these hours, at least we can set aside for you not to be interrupted and do that sort of thing. And that's the type of conversation that nobody wants to have with their boss.
Right.
But is ultimately the only way to incorporate any of this sort of change if you're not the CEO calling the shots.
Yeah, because you're forced to have a hard conversation up the ladder, right? Which is...
Not everybody loves conflict like I do.
It's true. It's true. It's like, Mike, if you bring something up that's going to contradict something he thinks, he's all on board and he gets fired up and he's ready for it. That's not normal. I don't know if people are aware of that, but...
No.
So yes, you have to put boundaries around it, right? That's a lot of what this can be boiled down into. I don't know, like, I have a handful of action items that I'll get to when we get to that point, but like this is just an interesting, like, set some rules of engagement, right? For how to put things into your process.
Yes. So one of the rules they talk about, we kind of hit on this already, keep the email short, because the sender typically is going to be the one who sends the 1-minute message with a couple of questions, and then the recipient is the one who has to spend hours responding.
Yes.
Another one that they talked about here, though, which I thought was pretty brilliant, is to disconnect email from an individual. So that means that if I am doing support, people do not email Mike at company.com. They email support at company.com. So what this does is it lets the sender think that they're still communicating via email, but it allows the recipient to use a ticket-based system, something like Help Scout or Zendesk, something like that, where a bunch of people can work on things together and they can put things in the right places and people can respond to tickets much more efficiently, much more effectively. And the person who asked the question via email has no idea that they're not receiving an email from a specific person anymore. And this is the kind of thing that we should be looking for when we're trying to change the way that we do email, in my opinion. We're not going to get everybody to agree right now, hey, let's just not use email anymore. That's not going to happen. But there are ways for you maybe to not use email as much anymore. This isn't, in my opinion, and maybe there's some gray area here, but in my opinion, this isn't like pulling a fast one on someone. This is not tricking them because you're doing something else. This is actually a better solution for everybody involved, because the person who's making the request doesn't want you to question all of their systems. They just want an answer to their thing. So they don't really care how you get that answer to them, and you don't really care about what they're going to do next. You just want to get it off your plate as quickly as possible. Ultimately, I think, we do need to get to the point. We do need to have the difficult conversations for people that we receive these types of requests from often and say, hey, is there a better way to do this? But if you can just get the thing done, I mean, that's what David Allen would say to do, right?
Right. But I mean, if you start putting this whole thing together, and I know we've got one more principle here to cover, but if you start putting it all together, you need to be careful with how you set up your process so that it is being mindful of the attention capital that you have, right?
Yes,
so that's
true.
You got to kind of tie those two together, because the process is designed to move things forward without fragmenting your workload. And then you have this protocol that you put in place for how things should be done, like how that process should work. But then that brings us to chapter 7.
Exactly.
Which is the specialization principle, which is effectively a principle that tells you focus on the things you should be doing, focus on the things you're good at.
Yep.
Don't let things get into your process that you shouldn't be doing. Like, don't be dumb. Like, don't say yes to everything.
Which is an argument that we've heard over and over and over again. So people maybe hear that and they're like, well, I don't need to hear this again. I don't think you've heard it this way. The story that he tells at the beginning of this chapter is the perfect story at this point in the book because it's kind of self-deprecating on Cal. He talks about how his grandfather was a professor and his grandfather wrote a bunch of books. He ended up with a chair in religious studies and a role as a provost at a large theological seminary. And he's kind of poking fun at himself as like, well, I'm the one with the computer. I'm the one with the technology. I should be running circles around my grandpa. And he's like, I'm not there.
Yes.
So the point here is that the technology doesn't necessarily make us more productive. And the real point he's making as it pertains to this chapter is that computers specifically cause us not to specialize. And that I think I 100% agree with. It's easy to say, well, I can just take care of this. And I have fallen into this trap myself over and over and over and over and over again. It's one of the reasons that the few times I've tried to work with a VA, it has never worked out. Because I know intellectually I should spend up to 30 times as long as this thing takes in order to delegate this so someone else can do it. But I get annoyed the minute it takes me even slightly longer than I could have finished it myself. So this chapter, what it did for me is it helped me realize that there is a lot of value in specialization. And I am not committing to try to use a VA again, but I am committing as an action item to make a list of things that I can delegate. I think that's kind of like the first step. So kind of an anti-Mike action item with this one, very specific, very measurable. By next time, will I have a list of things that I can delegate? And then from that point, I can figure out if I do want to delegate this thing, what are the steps that I must do in order to make this delegatable? But that's not what I'm saying for this specific one. I just want a list of things that I could potentially offload.
Overlay Emily Wapnick's book, How to Be Everything, on top of this.
Yeah.
That's a thing that crossed my mind. Computers make it possible to do tons of things, right? Think about how many different content creators, you and I, video work, editing. Now we're doing streaming, we do audio work, we do writing, we do publishing, we do all sorts of different things. Finances and such, there's a ton of this stuff that's very wide-ranging that we do. Emily Wapnick's book was about how to do that, essentially. How do you keep yourself engaged when you have a bunch of different things, and making sure that you do have that. But anyway, how do you do everything versus Cal Newport's? You got to focus on the things that you're good at. Pick what you're going to do. Don't try to do all of this different stuff, right? So, I don't know. I thought it was an interesting way to say it, in that computers make it possible. They make a lot of things accessible to us, right? Which is awesome. But at the same time, it's similar to this broader email conversation, in that, yes, email does have some theoretical benefits, right? But the way we actually use it turns out to be not so great. Computers in general can have that same argument, in that they make a lot of things possible, but that doesn't mean it's something you should or should do. This is the what's the name for it? I can't think of it. But if there's one small good thing out of a tool or a product, we'll tend to say, oh yeah, I'll accept that because it makes it possible for me to connect with people across the world. Yes, Facebook may allow you to do that, but there's a whole baggage of things that are going to come with it. Email's the same way. The computer in general is the same way. Cal Newport's push is to don't just default to do all the things. Don't just default to take it if there's one small piece of good in it. Ask the question, does it benefit overall? And then bring it in. if it is a yes?
I think maybe there's a difference between being a multi-potentialite and doing a bunch of busy work. I think that's really what Cal's getting at in this specific section, because he talks about on page 233 that busyness is controllable. If you decide to be visibly busy, you know you can certainly achieve this goal. And that's the distinction for me. I don't know if that's exactly what he's saying, but with a multi-potentialite, I view that as like, I'm a podcaster, I'm a writer, I'm a video creator, but all of those have a common thread that tie them together, that make them valuable things to be doing. Maybe it's content creator, although I don't really like that specific term. And I feel like with multi-potentialite in Emily Wapnick's book, it's kind of, you're doing all these things and there is that common thread between them. And Cal Newport is basically saying, yeah, go ahead and identify the things that are important, but the things that aren't important, and he's making the case, email, hyperactive hive mind type stuff, that's the thing that you should be looking to delegate. For example, the scheduling of the meetings we're talking about in the last chapter. That's a kind of thing that you could outsource. He talks about design or outsourcing email, outsourcing design, outsourcing social media, which there are people who your multi-potentialite bent could be that I am a designer. I like the design process, and that's part of what makes my brand. So for me personally, I kind of feel like the sketchnote stuff is kind of part of that. Could I delegate the production of a sketchnote file? Yes, I could, and that would free up more time for me, but that's kind of my thing. That's part of the important stuff. And so I'm not going to delegate that. I think that's anyways how I would separate those in my head, but maybe I'm wrong with that.
No, I think you're right. I think that makes sense. I was just mostly thinking about, like, Emily was trying to show us how to do a whole bunch of different types of things at the same time versus Cal's push to find the thing.
Sure. Okay.
It wouldn't even be the thing. Just find what is your specialty. And that could be a handful of things, and focus on those, as opposed to trying to do so many things at one time. So to me, it just felt like it was two different ways of coming at it. So,
yep,
for what it's worth.
Makes sense. I'm glad you brought that up, though, because on the surface, they seem like very contradictory. I think they're actually pretty complementary, though. Basic idea is that you've got only so much attention, only so much time, and you've got to spend it on the right things, and you've got to identify what those right things are. And maybe it's not clearly defined as like this one thing that I do over and over and over again, like Cal maybe would, or at least that's the impression you get from reading Cal's stuff. And Emily's like, no, do this, that, and connect the dots in your own weird way inside of your brain.
Right.
But ultimately, budget your attention. Whatever you don't budget ends up being wasted, whether that's money, whether that's time, whether that's attention. So just considering that there is a bunch of stuff that you probably just do because, this is part of the process. And the big thing for me is thinking about, well, maybe that doesn't need to be part of your process. Maybe you can't get away from scheduling the meetings. Maybe you can't get away from dealing with email, but maybe you can change the way that you do some of these things.
Yeah, just to put this whole thing together, because we've kind of been talking around things that aren't email here, even though like that's his main driver here in the book. But you've got these 4 pieces, right? The attention capital principle. This is all for how to build a world without email. Attention capital principle, the process principle, the protocol principle, and the specialization principle. And yes, the book is about a world without email. But if you notice, like when we talked about these, yes, email's kind of an undertone, but it's not like point blank, this is what we're talking about. He's not explaining how to manage email folders. He's not talking about how to move conversations that happen on email elsewhere explicitly. He's not saying that. He's just talking about the knowledge work that we do. There are better ways to communicate about that work through these 4 principles of managing your attention, building the process for managing that knowledge work, the protocol for creating what that knowledge work is, and then choosing what of the knowledge work you're going to do with the specialization. So it's not necessarily like this is the part where, and I know we're coming up here on this conclusion and such, but this is the part where I was a little bit taken off guard here, because when we started this, remember what I said? I was very skeptical about this because email is kind of this fundamental piece in a lot of what I do, but some of what is in this particular book, involves the work outside of email and how to manage it outside of email, as opposed to defaulting to a communication tool that's asynchronous that comes with a bunch of flaws. Finding other systems that could do the same thing. So it is kind of fascinating when you start thinking about it that way, because it's at least caused me to start thinking through, how do I get work? Like, how do I get what that is that I need to do, and how do I design how things come into that process? What is the process? How do I manage that whole thing? So it's at least prompted those thought processes. So I think it's just been like, yes, email is the conversation point and the potential problem here, but the broader principles for getting off of it could be pretty wide-ranging and not necessarily just email. It could be getting you off of Slack. It could be getting you off of forums online. It could get you off of all sorts of stuff. But it's, how do you manage the work that you've been assigned?
And recognizing that email is not as innocuous as it seems at first. Kind of transitioning to the conclusion here, but he makes a statement that email isn't additive, it's ecological, and it changes everything. So the typical approach with email is it's just this one message, it's this thing in isolation, and his real argument is that no, it's the hyperactive hive mind that comes along with it, and all of these other costs that are really hard to measure, but that's the thing we really got to be taking into the equation when we decide, is this the right tool to be using in this particular thing? And this is also where he talks about Neil Postman and how every advantage a new technology offers, there's always a corresponding disadvantage. And if you came into this book just blindly doing email because I got to do it, it is what it is, and you're kind of not to the point maybe even where I was, where like I hate this with a fiery passion with the intensity of 1,000 suns. But you don't really even think about it. I feel like this book is very eye-opening. But even for someone like me, it's a call to action for looking for alternatives, because I admit that while email isn't a big part of my job, it is something that I just default to, well, I got to do this. And it takes as long as it takes, and I've been able to minimize that as much as I can. And part of that is like I'm setting my own rules, and I tick some people off with that. Like, you could make the argument in terms of Cal's focused email journey, I'm farther along than a lot of other people. But even with that, I find myself having to take a hard look in the mirror and say, you know what? Like, I never even thought about this, that, and the other thing. And why am I still doing this?
There's a point in this last chapter, in this conclusion, that I thought was kind of interesting, in that when Henry Ford was building cars, everybody had a process for how that was supposed to work, right?
Yep.
And we've talked about what that is. When he came to the assembly line process, it completely changed the car making industry and process. And so much of what people had been trying to do previous to that assembly line was find ways to build cars quicker by making it easier to manufacture the parts that went into it, by making it easier to get things to and from that car as it sat on the shop floor, which is why Henry Ford's process of moving the car was such a big fundamental change. With email, we haven't had that moment yet where there's the big fundamental change that brings it into its full glory, in that all email has done so far has taken normal office practices and made them move faster.
Yeah.
Even though it hasn't changed what those practices are or the fundamental of how the business operates, right? All it has done is move the memo process quicker and to more people. So it's propagated it even further. So it hasn't actually had its big fundamental shift to bring it into a place where it has its full benefits. So this is some of what he's calling for, I guess, in that if you can use these systems, because even look at the processes and such that he's talking about. He's even talking about things getting into the process by sending an email. Like that's what he's referencing in that. So he's still saying like email is a thing that is used for these cases. So yes, he could see a world without email, but in the interim, like trying to get better at using it is a big thing as well. So,
and this is the hard part, because there are companies like Basecamp we mentioned earlier with their Hey email, which are redefining some of the rules around email. There is no inbox in Hey. There's just stuff that comes in. There's no concept of like, these are the messages that I have to clear through in order to get to inbox 0. I mean, that just completely breaks if you use Hey. But that means that Hey is something separate. It's not IMAP. It's not POP3. And that means that you have to use specifically Hey's client, which the nerd in me is like, no, use the standard. But as long as you continue to use the standard, you're stuck with the standard. So it requires companies like Basecamp trying new things like Hey. There's going to be this point, though, where things are super stressful in the meantime, because you're going to have a bunch of different things all over the place. Gmail is kind of like that. It's sort of IMAP, but not quite. And so whenever there's a new version of Mac OS Mail, Gmail changes something and it breaks. It seems like the first version, it never works. And then they have to make a change, and then eventually it does. And the more different options there are out there, the more different standards or protocols that people are using, it is going to get worse before it gets better. But I do completely agree that there is going to be a point. You're right. We're not there yet. And I don't know how far in the future it is, but there will be a point when we think about the way that we deal with email right now. And we're like, wow, how archaic was that?
Right. For sure. All right. Action items.
I actually have 2. I'm going to attempt to use Kanban boards for things that I am going to get done. And I am also going to make my list of things to delegate. So what that looks like for next time, I think, is that the Kanban boards will probably be inside of Todoist, but I'm not 100% sure about that yet. There are certain things about Todoist that bug me, like the different priority levels. There's only one priority, knock it off, Todoist. But maybe I can figure out a different way to use those. And the list is simple, so I'll just have a list of things that hopefully I can delegate.
There you go. I have 2. One of them you might laugh at me for, but one of them, the one you won't laugh at me about, is creating protocols for how tickets and such come to me, like how support comes to me in my day job. I do fully control that system. So how people go about bringing things to me and how people get things into that process and defining that process. Right now, it's just you have an issue, I'm going to go fix it right now. That's a lot of how I do things. Even if it doesn't need done right now, a lot of times I will do that just so I don't have to try to keep it in any system whatsoever. So I've built in a lot of ability to have distractions in the day. Like I have a lot of time available for that, and I've just planned on that. So I just use it for those things. But I don't have clear processes for the things that aren't able to be done immediately and tracking those. I do have an assistant that works under me at the moment. So trying to manage things between the two of us gets to be a little bit messy at the moment. So using some of what Cal is recommending here with the process and protocol pieces specifically, that's some of what I want to try to do at our church. So that's one. The second is, so I do still have email on my phone, right? This is the thing that people tell you all the time, get email off your phone. I can't do that, because so many of the systems that I use on a daily basis send like the codes to get into it, and they send it via email, but I'm trying to get into it from my phone because I'm moving around so many different times, so many different places, that it's impossible for me to constantly get back to my computer to get that code, to type it in and such. It's just a pain. Maybe that would be a good thing, but I don't find that it's easy for me to get email off of my phone because of that. So I had a thought on how to maybe subvert this, in that I could potentially create a Siri shortcut. This might be crazy. This is why I'm putting so many caveats on. I think I can create a Siri shortcut that replaces the email icons on my phone, and I could tap that. It would check the time and day, and if it's outside of working hours, it just gives me an alert. If it's inside working hours, it could take me to the email app that I originally wanted to go to.
Interesting.
I don't know if this is a good idea or a bad idea. It's one that I had a couple days ago as I was reading this and thought that would be helpful, because I don't feel like I can get this off because of the need for the security aspect. So maybe I can just kind of subvert it, in that I can leave it. That way I'm not deleting it and reinstalling it every single day, every time I've got to have that, because that's just a pain. So I've thought about trying to do something along those lines. I don't know if that's a good idea or not, but it would be better than what I have now. That much I know. So
it would be better. Sounds a little bit like a complicated compromise, but
that might be good. I don't know. It's kind of like setting a protocol for checking your email. I don't know.
Yeah.
Who knows? Maybe I just wait until later in the day to check that stuff and do an email run once a day. I don't know what that is. I may not actually build it, but it's an idea that I'm trying to explore at the moment.
All right. Cool. I'm anxious to see if that goes anywhere.
We'll talk next time about how much of a failure it is.
It's over my head for sure. All right. Style and rating.
Let's do it.
Okay. So this is a very Cal Newport book. I really like his style. There are occasional places where he's so smart, it's hard to keep up with him. I mentioned like the story on the information theory, and I'm sure in the world he runs in, like that's an elementary principle, but first time I'd ever heard about it, I have no frame of reference, and he's trying to condense it down into a very brief thing, which for the most part, his stories, that works really well. You get the main point, but with this one, it felt like I really had to dig to understand what the heck he was talking about. So there are a few points in this book where it is not going to be an easy read, but for the most part, I feel like it is an easy read. It's very engaging. His thoughts are very well put together, and he's very articulate. There's not a whole lot of like one-liners, like quote type things. I called out a couple of them as we were recording here today, but for the most part, it's just a very solidly written book with a lot of entertaining stories that very much support the point that he's trying to make. Feels kind of like Ryan Holiday in that sense. I do think there is a chance that if you pick up this book just because it's Cal Newport and you are a little bit skeptical like Joe was at the beginning, that you absolutely hate this. I'm anxious to hear what you have to say. I really liked it. I feel like he makes a very compelling argument for a world without email, hence the title. I do think it's broader than just email. He talks about the hyperactive hive mind. And I don't know how many times he uses that term, but it's a lot. That's really what he's driving at.
Yeah, it's a ton.
I don't think this is like a change the world type book, but I also think it has the potential to be. We could look back in 10 years from now and be like, this is the one that really kind of shifted the discussion around email as a productivity tool. I think we kind of have that approach when we think about deep work. At least you and I do. Maybe not everybody else who has read it based on your specific work situation, but I think people like us, knowledge workers, we could look at that and be like, yeah, that significantly changed my life for the better and totally impacted the way that I get my work done, or at least part of my work done. So that being said, I think it's difficult to rate it in terms of like future impact that it may have versus impact that it has right now. I'm going to put it at 4.5 because I feel like on the low end, assuming that this is just Cal's manifesto and everybody completely ignores this and we deal with email for the next 100 years, it's still a really good book. There's still a lot of great principles in here. There's still a lot of things that you can do that can make email a little bit less of an annoyance right now. That would be the 4.0 side. The 5.0 would be if he's 100% hitting this and we look back at this and be like, yeah, he was the first guy that really said, email's not tenable, and he gets credited with like the whole big push away from email as a communication medium. I have no idea if and when that happens. So I feel putting it in the middle is probably the fair thing to do at 4.5, because even if, he's wrong, he's not wrong in the large sense with like everything that he says here. There's still a lot of stuff that you can apply right now. But he does kind of make his moonshot at the end of like, hey, this is coming. Kind of, it feels like, so he can point back to it if that happens and be like, see, I said that there.
I told you.
Yep. And I don't think that's a non-zero chance that has a non-zero chance of happening. So
yeah, I think this book is one it's a headier book than his other ones, right? I feel like as time goes on, he's thought about this a lot more. And I also think that he spent a lot of time on this book, potentially more than he has on his other ones. And you can tell that in the wordsmithing that's done in this one, because there are some sentences that I'm like, okay, I got to stop and reread that one. Like, what is he getting at? What did he just say? Like, there were a number of those in this one. I don't remember having that experience with his other books, namely Deep Work and Digital Minimalism. So I think this is one that's designed to be more long-term. Like, this is one that it's set up to be one that you read and then process over time.
Sure.
That's kind of my gut feel on that. The problem with that is that he has a handful of references to very specific tools.
Yeah.
We talked about this with Getting Things Done. Like, where in the very, very first edition of Getting Things Done, there were a lot of references to specific tools and apps and such. And in the rewrite, they pulled all that out. And I think for the better on that one. But Cal Newport does call out specific apps and tools. And my concern was, what happens if Trello shutters its doors here next month?
Yep.
Then what?
That's true.
He's got a book that just came out that's no longer available. Like, it just doesn't. So it was weird to me because it felt like this is a very evergreen, long-term written book. And yet he has some very time-specific pieces in it. So I'm sure he thought through that, but it seems weird.
The Trello example is genius, by the way, because they were acquired by Atlassian, I believe, which makes Jira. They could tomorrow decide this free thing that people are using is no longer in our best business interest and try to force everybody over to Jira.
Correct. Yeah. And that's a very real possibility. Having worked with Atlassian stuff in the past, like, that would not surprise me at all if we saw that announcement this afternoon. So I don't know. I mean, that's a concern I have with the book itself, but I think that's probably a bit of a minor one. We talked earlier about my skepticism coming into this. I was pleasantly surprised to see him cover broader things than just email. I thought we were going to be talking about just email, but this involved Slack and all the chat systems, and like, he involves a lot of that in it as well. And then terms this hyperactive hive mind thing and helps us understand that that's actually what we're fighting against. I'm all on board with that. I'm not saying that email is in a rosy state for me at all. I'm definitely going to be trying to change up how I do things with email. I'm not sure what that looks like, but it's something I'm trying to figure out that process, like I talked about earlier. So as far as like how to rate this and how to obviously this is one I'm going to recommend to people. Again, it's a bit headier, so I'm going to be doing this with people that I think can handle a little bit more difficult of a book. Like, this isn't one that's as easy to read, I think, as like Digital Minimalism. That one was just, you could cruise through that thing very easily. This one you kind of had to, at least for me, I had to take a little more time with it just because it was so dense and it was so heady and such. So that is a thing to keep in mind. I will be recommending it to a number of folks. I think you nailed it with the rating. I think it should be 4.5 in that it doesn't feel like, part of this might be because the title is a little bit off in my mind. I think the title of the book is maybe to get sales somewhat, which is a little bit of a hit, I think, to Cal Newport. I mean, he's got it named, I think, probably correctly as far as what people want from him. But because he covers so much more than email, and like, look at the 4 principles, right? The attention, capital, process, protocol, specialization. All of the things in there are about how to manage knowledge work. It doesn't have anything to do with, I shouldn't say anything. It doesn't have a focus on email. So this is why I was trying to summarize, like, this is how it applies to email. So that's a thing, right? So I don't know. It just, something about it doesn't quite click for me to get it all the way to the 5.0, and maybe I'll change my mind and this will be like how to read a book, and I'll continually think about this all the time and constantly and wish I had rated it 5, in which case episode 200 I'll change it. So at this point in time, I'm going to put it at 4.5 because I feel like that's about right given all of this.
Cool. Let's put this one on the shelf. What are we covering next, Joe?
It'll be fun. The Art of Witty Banter by Patrick King. You and I do enough voice work and enough video work now that I feel like it would be good. The subtitle on this is Be Clever, Quick, and Magnetic.
Awesome.
I'm looking forward to this one. I'm excited about it. It might be a train wreck, but it'll be fun.
All right. After that, I wish Otter was here because I'm going to pick one of his books. We're going to do Think Again, The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know by Adam Grant. I think this came up. This was in your Analog Joe stream, right? That this came up?
It was on one of the Twitch streams, I think.
I remember being in the room for that one, and when we started talking about that, I was like, this sounds like my kind of book. So
yeah,
we'll do that one next. You got any Gap books?
I finished up reading Purple Cow by Seth Godin, but other than that, I haven't done anything in between since then. You?
I did not get my Gap book finished, which is The Road Less Stupid by Keith Cunningham, but I am not going to only partially read this one this time. I'm going to pick it again and get through this one.
Okay.
All right. Well, that's it for this episode then. I want to say before we go, thank you to all of the Bookworm Club Premium members for supporting the show. Thank you to people who are attending live. This always makes the recording a lot of fun, but huge thanks to the people who are willing to pay a couple bucks a month to help us keep the lights on. If you want to go to club.bookworm.fm/membership, you can sign up to support the show, and you get a few bonuses with that, like a wallpaper that I designed, some Gap book episodes that Joe had recorded, and links to all of the MindNode files for all of the books that we read. When I get done with those, I upload them to the club. There's a few new ones I added last week. I fell a bit behind, but it should be up to date now. So you get all that stuff, and the place to go if you want to do that again is club.bookworm.fm/membership.
One other thing to point out, because Mike just did this as well, you can still get t-shirts and sweatshirts and apparently onesies for babies.
That's true.
With the Bookworm logo on them. And Mike finally wore out his Bookworm sweatshirt and had to order a new one. But if you're interested in that, just go to bookworm.fm. There's a link in the menu there for picking up merchandise if that's of interest to you. So again, thank you to all of you who have joined us live and those of you who continue to support the show. We couldn't do it without you. So thank you so much for doing that. And if you're one of the folks reading along with us as we go through these books, pick up The Art of Witty Banter by Patrick King. We'll read that and cover it in a couple weeks.